What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Canadian Football Fantasy Fix for Week 2 of the 2021 CFL season. I'm your host, Ryan Coop. Welcome in, welcome all. The CFL Fantasy season's officially underway. The first week of CFL games has come and gone this past weekend. What a weekend of CFL football it was. A lot of exciting action around the league this weekend, and CFL Fantasy is quickly off to the races with some strong performances in week number 1. We're going to get into talking about the options available to you for week 2 of the CFL Fantasy season. But of course, before we get into that, we got to take a look back at week number 1. And let's start off and let's get right into it, talking about the quarterbacks in week 1 of CFL Fantasy. Here they are. Here's how they all performed. Your number 1 quarterback, the only one to put up over 20 points in the first week, is probably not the one we expected. McLeod Bethel Thompson of the Toronto Argonauts, one of the lower priced options, more of a value pick, 24.6 points. He gets the start ahead of Nick Arbuckle and has an excellent day in leading the Argos to a win in their season opener. Up next, Zach Caleros, 19 points, a pretty solid week for him. Was able to maneuver around the pocket quite a bit, escape the pressure on him, and made a lot of great throws on the run, including finding Kenny Lawler for 2 touchdown passes that helped his stats this week. Pretty week you'd expect from Cody Fajardo for the most part, 17.8 points. Strong start to the game, slow finish in the second half for the Riders there. In the middle of the pack here, we've got 2 BC quarterbacks in what was an interesting scenario where we all thought Riley was going to start. He was listed number 1 on the depth chart. He ends up pulling himself right at kickoff, and Nathan Rourke comes in, plays in the first half, struggles quite a bit. Riley comes out to start the second half, but can't finish the game, so Rourke comes back in. Those 2 BC quarterbacks combined for almost 400 passing yards, but it doesn't really help you out a whole ton if you were one who was high on Michael Riley in week 1, which I was as well. He was one of my recommended options at quarterback. So if you got burned by that, I apologize. There's no way we could have known. That's why I make this disclaimer every week, is don't go bet the farm on any of these picks that I suggest, because things like this can happen. It could be unpredictable, and I don't want to be the reason you lose the farm, as I always say. So an unfortunate circumstance there for anybody who took Michael Riley. A couple other high-priced quarterbacks, high-valued quarterbacks, Jeremiah Mazzoli, Bo Levi Mitchell, and Trevor Harris, also having a bit of a downside to of what we usually expect from them. Trevor Harris especially. I mean, we expected against that Ottawa defense a huge game from Harris. He did put up 333 yards, but that was accompanied by 3 interceptions and no touchdowns. So a very disappointing week for Trevor Harris, who was my number 1 quarterback option and the quarterback I chose for my own roster coming into week 1. And then rounding it out at the bottom, just a rough day for Matt Nichols. 70 completion yards only, but somehow they win the game. The Red Blacks won despite 7 first downs. And not a great day from quarterback Matt Nichols. Only 3.5 for fantasy points. If you took him as a sleeper option, that didn't help you out a whole ton there. But if you're a Red Blacks fan, you'll take it anyways, right? You'll be celebrating this week after the big win thanks to their defense. Taking a look at how the running backs performed this week, right at the top, James Wilder Jr., 25.1 points in his Elks debut. A fantastic week. He's a guy last week we talked about as somebody who's going to get a lot of targets through the air. 2019, about 66% of his fantasy production came through the air. You get points for receptions. It's great when you have a running back that, gets 7 catches, adds something like 70 yards through the air to what he did on the ground. A fantastic day for James Wilder Jr. Right behind him, a couple backups that got in due to injury. James Butler gets the start for BC as Shaq Cooper ends up placed on the 1-game injured list and puts up 17.7, a nice day for him. And Brady Oliveira in Winnipeg, 126 yards in his first real game. He did play, he played in 1 game last season, but then got injured in that opener and never really actually got a chance to properly play. Andrew Harris wasn't ready to go. Oliveira steps in. A fantastic day for him, just missing that touchdown that I really thought he was going to get at the end of that game that would have propelled him even further up these ranks here. In the middle of the pack, William Powell, 13.5. Great first half for him. Only got 1 carry in the second half, though. Something to watch coming into week number 2. John White, 11.1 for Toronto. A couple Calgary running backs combining and splitting some time there and some touches to combine for about 15 points. And a little more on the disappointing side of things, Sean Thomas Erlington of the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Only 6.6 points this week in the official CFL Fantasy game. Not too much of a surprise, given he was facing the Bombers' run defense that was best in the league in 2019. I think, I was weary of Erlington coming into the week, and he didn't have a fantastic performance. So we'll see if he can bounce back this week as well. But 6.6 still gets you a little bit going there. And then Timothy Flanders in Ottawa, that was one of the sleeper picks I liked for last week. 5.6 points, not too much going for Flanders there, as Ottawa's offense really did not do much at all in that game against the Elks. Looking at the wide receivers, Lucky Whitehead of the BC Lions, 24.6 points, leads the way after he picks up, I believe, a 70-something yard touchdown catch from Nathan Rourke. That's the exact type of performance you're going to expect to get every once in a while from a guy like Whitehead. I figured if he was going to have a big day, it was going to be a long touchdown. They were going to utilize his speed, and that ended up being a good day for him there. Kenny Lawler at 22.9 picks up 2 touchdowns against the Ticats. Jalen Acklin, 22.8, a big day as he becomes one of the go-to receivers in Hamilton with no Braylon Addison, no DeVere Posey out there in week 1. Brian Burnham, Kamar Jordan, 2 guys that we would expect to be near the top. Great to see Kamar Jordan not missing a beat after he missed, everybody missed 2020, and he missed the 2019 season as well. So great to see him back and performing well. Bit of a surprise given the depth chart coming into the week. Ricky Collins Jr. at 18.6. He was listed as a backup on the depth chart, ended up being Toronto's leading receiver, most targeted receiver, and put up over 100 yards, I believe, in this one. So he puts up 18.6, a little bit misleading there. You see a guy as a backup on a depth chart, you think to stay away from him. So we'll have to monitor that going forward. Maybe if we see him as a backup again this week, once the depth charts come out, maybe don't buy too much stock into that, Getting into the middle of the pack, you have, Darrell Walker, Kyron Moore, Brandon Banks, Shaq Evans, Dominic Rhymes. Decent, solid weeks by all of them. Braden Lenius, 11.1 points. Value pick at $2,500 last week. He was one of the guys I had mentioned as a great sleeper option. It does pick up the touchdown pass for the Riders and gets him above 10 points. That's a nice pickup at a low dollar there. Continuing to look at some of the guys who hovered around or less than the 10-point mark. A couple interesting names here. Daniel Braverman for the Toronto Argonauts, 10.9 points. Their kick returner, most of that through the return game, but he got quite a few targets as well and was the second most targeted receiver for the Argos, ahead of guys even, ahead of everybody besides Eric Rogers, Jawan Brescison, Davaris Daniels, even ahead of Rogers, I guess, because Ricky Collins Jr. was the leader, followed by Braverman, Rogers, kind of splitting into some targets there. A bit of a disappointing week for a couple of Elks receivers that we thought would have a big one. Greg Ellingson, 10.2. Again, picked up some points really late at the end of the game. That final drive, he had a couple catches. Other than that, we're looking at a 5-point week for Ellingson. Or Monty Edwards, only a 5.5 week. Jawan Brescison, 7.9. He does pick up the one touchdown, but that was his only target or his only catch of the night. I was expecting a bigger day from him as well. And then as we round out the bottom here, RJ Harris for Ottawa. You expect him to be the go-to guy there at wide receiver, which is fair. But again, not a great day for that Ottawa offense. So he only puts up 4 points. And Hergy Mayala, a guy I did put on my roster. I was high on last week. Only 3.6. So he did not get the targets or the touchdowns that I expect him to get in week number 1. And then finally, looking at the defenses, here's how they all shaped out. The Ottawa leading the way, 19 points of outstanding defensive performance by the Red Blacks. I don't think we really saw that coming, very many of us, especially going up against that potent Edmonton offense. But a couple big plays, including a fantastic pick 6 by Abdul Kanay, who made several massive plays. In fact, Ottawa's defense in Kanay and Avery Williams picking up 2 of the 3 CFL Player of the Week nominations. So kudos to the Red Blacks there. The Bombers defense picks up 16 off of a couple turnovers and managing to hold Hamilton to 6 points. The Riders picking up 11 points of their own. And then perhaps maybe a bit of a disappointing day for a Hamilton defense that we expect to be very good this year. Just 4 points for them. So as much as I hyped up last week, you don't get too many points too often from your defenses. We did get some big performances out of, in particular, Ottawa and Winnipeg that could have made a difference for your fantasy roster. Those are how all the players performed in week 1. So the question now is, how did I do? This is the lineup I ended up going with for week number 1. 102.4 points. I did take Trevor Harris, who had a disappointing day. I was expecting a blowout of Edmonton over Ottawa. So a bit of a letdown there. But James Wilder Jr. gets heavy usage, puts up 25.1. I did add in Brady Oliveira for the Bombers. I like that option against Ticats defense, especially with Ted Laurent not out playing. Jalen Acklin, again, became the number 2 option at receiver in Hamilton, which is why I added him into my lineup. Disappointing week for Hergy Mayala. Greg Ellingson puts up 10.2, and then I did actually jump on that Bombers defense when I saw that. No Braylon Addison, no DeVere Posey, and no Chris Van Zyl at offensive line for the Ticats. So you got to jump on those matchups. You got to jump on those possible injuries there that might make a difference in a week for CFL Fantasy. All in all, a great week for myself in week 1. I hope you all had successful weeks as well. I know there were definitely some up and down performances, and you maybe got screwed a little bit by the whole quarterback situation out in BC. So if that's the case, I apologize. You hate to see it. And hopefully we don't have something like that happen again going forward. Hopefully we have a clearer picture of who will actually be starting. Well, let's start getting into our week 2 preview. I think, last week I kind of went position by position, looked at some of the best top, medium, low-priced options at each. I think going forward, the way I want to approach this is going game by game. It will just allow me to talk about more of these players in a more efficient fashion, I would say, as I can, talk about them all within the same context of the team and what I expect their team to do in their matchups. So let's dive into the first matchup of the week, the Thursday night game. It is the BC Lions at the Calgary Stampeders. Here are your notable fantasy options for week number 2 in this game. Quarterback for BC Lions. my recommendation, stay away from either of these for week number 2. They both had good performances in the halves or so they played, but in week 1, but we don't know what's going to happen in week 2. We could see the same thing. I think Riley will be a game time decision, and going up against a Calgary defense that I think is pretty good in its own right. I think I recommend staying away from BC's quarterbacks in this one. I like the option of Bo Levi Mitchell at quarterback, though. For Calgary, a modest week in week 1 for him, 250 or so yards. He does put up the 1 touchdown pass. Bo Levi does, I believe, 1 or 2 interceptions there as well. But I like the bounce back week for him because those aren't typical Bo Levi numbers. You would expect to see, a 300-yard passing game, a couple touchdowns to go along with it. And I like the matchup with BC because I think they struggled for a good chunk of that game against the Saskatchewan Roughriders. The Riders jumped out to like a 32-0 lead against them, put up 3 touchdowns early in the game. If the Riders can do that, I like Bo's potential to do that in week number 2 and expect a big bounce back week from him. Especially, you look at how BC's defense did against the offensive line for the Riders that, much was made coming in about how inexperienced they were. I think Calgary's O-line is a little bit better than that even, so they should give more time for Bo to find his open receivers. So I really like him as a quarterback option for week 1. Other options I like in this game, again, BC running back situation up in the air still at the point of recording this on Tuesday. Who's going to start? Will Cooper be off the bat 1 game injured list and come back in, or will James Butler get another start? I'm honestly probably staying mostly away from BC in week number 2. I like, they were the top passing team in week 1. Burnham, Whitehead, Rhymes, Durant all put up over 10 points on the week. And Lucky Whitehead was your leader at wide receiver. But that was against a Saskatchewan defense that was missing a lot of pieces. I think Calgary's defense is a little stronger against the pass. Either an inexperienced Rourke or an injured Riley at quarterback. These guys will probably put up some points still, I'm sure. I'm just not sure. A lot of these are kind of higher in the price range, whether I want to jump on a particular one. You expect Burnham, for example, to probably still put up a good week, but is he worth it? And the potential that with the quarterback situation that he doesn't at $10,655. So I'm hesitant to go towards BC here at all. I don't mind the option of either running back. James Butler at $2,500 if he's starting again is not a bad value play as well against Calgary. But to me, I'm staying away from the passing game for BC. For the Stampeders, Kadeem Carey had himself a pretty decent week number 1. He did share some touches with Ante Milanovic-Leader, which is maybe a bit of a concern if that's going to be a consistent thing going forward, but not a bad day for him. I could see him having a decent running day against the Lions defense, who they really have, I believe 3 rookies on the defensive line this year, so very inexperienced along the line. Maybe a guy like Carey can get into kind of that second level of the defense. At wide receiver, it was a bit of a disappointing week for most of the Stamps receivers. Kamar Jordan was the big name, put up by 19.5 points, I think it was. Not a bad play there. I actually like Jordan as one of my top receiver options for week 2 because I'm high on Mitchell at quarterback, and I think Jordan's going to be a go-to receiver all season long. I think we're going to see targets split among the rest of the guys, but he should be number 1 week in and week out, and he had a great week 1, and I think he could replicate that again against BC. But the rest of these guys at wide receiver for Calgary, I think I'm staying away this week just because I don't know who's getting the targets. I thought it was going to be Mayala coming into last week, but he only had a couple catches, only put up less than 5 points. So Josh Huff seems like going back to last year and to start this year, he gets a decent number of targets too. So he's not a bad option if you're desperately looking for a cheaper Calgary receiver to go with. But to me, Kamar Jordan is the number one play here for the Stampeders at wide receiver. And then looking at the defenses, 3,987 for Calgary against BC. I don't mind that. The Riders defense did put up 11 points on them last week. Especially, Rourke struggled early on in that game. If maybe he comes out and struggles again, that's not a bad play to take the Stampeders defense there. They may be one of my top defense options this week. It's tough. It's really tough to nail it with the defenses and pick one that's going to get you a lot of points because you could get lucky. You could, have a day like Ottawa or Winnipeg did last week, or you could have a day like Hamilton did, which is one of the top defenses in the league and only put up 4 points. So it's all about the turnovers, and it's hard to pick a defense week in and week out. Moving on to our next game, we have the Toronto Argonauts coming off a win against the aforementioned Calgary Stampeders, facing the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in Winnipeg. This should be a great matchup. I am very excited to see these two teams play. The pick trend on CFL Pick'em is very heavily favored in the defending champs' direction for the Bombers, which to me is almost disrespectful to Toronto. They put up a great week against Calgary. They're a much improved team this year. That defense for Toronto is really good this year with the personnel changes they've made, and their offense was humming on all cylinders as well. So I think this will be a close matchup between these two teams. I think they're teams that have great defenses, but also have great offenses and can put some touchdowns on the board. So here are your top fantasy options at each position among these two teams. For the Argos, McLeod Bethel-Thompson gets a second straight start. Arbuckle wasn't ready to go for week number 1, so Bethel-Thompson gets the go there. Has an outstanding week, is the top passer, as I mentioned. And, we got the news already today that Ryan Dinwiddie saying that he will be the starter for week 2 coming off a short week. Still one of the cheaper options at the quarterback position and a guy who can put up premium numbers. I like Bethel-Thompson. There's a bit of a concern against that Bombers defense because of what they did to Hamilton, how they shut Mazzoli and that whole crew down there. But I think I still like him for his ability to put up maybe a 300-yard game here and find a couple of receivers for those touchdowns. So I love the Bethel-Thompson option, even against the strong Bombers defense, because I think the Bombers are going to take away the run game quite a bit, which they tend to do, which is, to get into my next point here, stay away from John White. I don't like the option. I don't like the option of White for week number 2. The Bombers holding Thomas Erlington to a very mild day in week number 1. White's a great running back in his own right. He didn't have a fantastic week 1 for the Argos. I think the Bombers are going to shut that down. We're going to see Toronto, go to the passing game quite a bit here, which should be a good day for their quarterback, should be a good day for their wide receivers. Question is, which one do you take? A lot of great options. I mean, Ricky Collins Jr. was the biggest producer for Toronto in week 1, putting up a 16-point week for them, or 18.6, sorry. Eric Rogers, I like that option week in and week out as a guy who's going to give you a red zone threat. He didn't get into the end zone last week, but he did for a 2-point convert. He is a guy who you would think they're going to go to near the end zone quite often, and he should be one of the highest targeted receivers in that Toronto offense. Ricky Collins, I expect to get heavy targets and yardage. Maybe not as often the touchdowns. I see him more of a yardage and heavy target guy there. Juwan Breskison, another guy I think we might see more of what we saw in week 1. Lower number of targets, but a guy they look to near the end zone as he put up a touchdown, much like he did in his small sample size last season. So you could get some points there if they look his direction. At $4,677, I don't mind. I don't mind the play of Breskison again in week number 2, but be cautious there, because if he doesn't get in the end zone and he's only getting 2 or 3 catches, then that's not going to put up the points you want. So there's kind of high risk, high reward. Those touchdowns mean a lot. One touchdown is the equivalent of 60 yards. But if they don't get the touchdown and they're not getting the yardage, they're not having a good day. DeVaris Daniels at 5,166. That's a guy. He's a guy that I see. He might have a good game here, a good game there. I don't see him consistently being a guy I'm putting in my fantasy lineup myself, to be honest. I think there's so many other options that I just ran through there that I have a hard time seeing Daniels being consistently the most targeted or the one in the end zone that they're looking to week in and week out. I think they have those other 3 guys. Those, to me, are the top receivers for Toronto this season. And then maybe an interesting value play is Daniel Braverman, who primarily you would expect to get his points in the return game. He is the returner for the Argos. But he picked up, I think, 5 targets or 5 catches as well and something like 50 yards through the air. So maybe they're starting to use him more in that regard. I don't mind taking a chance on a guy who is a returner, because they're going to put up yards for you through that. And if they get a couple catches, you could have another week like Braverman did, where he put up 10.9 and was the 3rd best receiver that the Argos had. So I like that option maybe for a value play if you're looking for one for the Argos. Looking at the Winnipeg side of things, quarterback Zach Collaros had himself a very fine week number 1 in his own right. Again, I talked about that earlier. I'm still hesitant on Collaros to see what he can do consistently week in and week out. His offensive line is the best in the league, which helps him get so much time back there and help him find his receivers. He's still one of the lower priced options at quarterback, but I'm maybe still staying away from Collaros this week, primarily because within his price range, Bethel Thompson's about $700 cheaper. I kind of like him as a better option this week, and I think Bo Levi Mitchell's only $500 or so more. So you could kind of have these other quarterbacks around Collaros that I think are going to perform better in week number 2. But he certainly benefits from a team that likes to put up a lot of touchdowns on offense. They may not put up a ton of yardage, but touchdowns are your big point grabbers. At running back, still remains to be seen. Andrew Harris did not practice on Tuesday again. Will he be ready for this week at game time? We don't know yet. Check those injury reports. Check those depth charts. I like either running back option for the Bombers this week, whichever one's in. Brady Oliveira last week, 126 yards on the ground, added a catch for 21 as well. Didn't get in the end zone, which would have added even more to it. The Bombers love to run the ball, and they love to use their running backs and run it down your throat. And I think against this Toronto defense, there's some potential to do that. I think in week 1, they gave up a combined 100 yards to Calgary's running backs. They have a great middle core, great defensive backfield there in Toronto. They can shut the passing game down, but I think again along the defensive line that there's a couple openings there to get the ball through to that second level for the Bombers running backs, and especially Harris comes at a high price, so he's harder to fit in your lineup. But if Oliveira is starting this week, he is pretty much a lock at the running back position for me personally. Looking at Winnipeg's wide receivers, Darvin Adams also did not practice on Tuesday. He could be out another week. I love Kenny Lawler as an option because of that touchdown threat. He put up 2 TDs in week 1. The Bombers also got to the red zone, and guess whose way Collaros looked again? It was Lawler. They were looking for the hat trick. That tells me, granted, I know Buck Pierce is going to, draw up a bit of a different offensive scheme for week 2, probably. But that tells me that Lawler is the guy they're looking to pick up touchdowns for them. He's their #1 touchdown target, and I think he is their best receiver as of right now on their team. One could argue Darvin Adams, Kenny Lawler. Look, I think Lawler is going to be a 1,000-yard receiver this year. And it's always hard to tell where the Bombers are going to spread the ball around to in that receiving core, but he should be a leader week in and week out. Nick Dembski's not a bad option as well. The Bombers like to use him in interesting ways, get him involved in a couple pitches, screen passes, rushing plays there. He can put up some yards for you and get a couple of receptions week in and week out. And then another sleeper pick here for the same reason I like Daniel Braverman. It's Charles Nelson. He's primarily involved in the return game, is how we're used to seeing him used by the Bombers, but he also did get some balls thrown his way on offense. He is a starting receiver on this team right now, combine the yardage on offense, combine the yardage in the return game. Not a bad week for Charles Nelson, who put up 9.6 points for the Bombers, 9.4, sorry, in week #1. He gets a couple extra touches. He's over 10 points at 2,500, which is really what you're going for from those value picks. And finally, defenses. I always like the potential of the Bombers' defense. They're a big play defense. They get the turnovers. That's what you want to see. Bethel Thompson, while he is a fantastic quarterback, the big knock on him typically is those turnovers. So there is some potential there. He didn't throw any interceptions in week 1, though, so maybe he's tightened up his game this year a little bit. Maybe the new look offense is helping him manage that game a little better there. So I could see it potentially being a big day for the Bombers. I could see it potentially not being a big day for the Bombers, which is why, and same thing with the Argos, so which is why I think I'm in the same boat again this week, where don't build your team around your defense. But if you can fit one of these defenses in, I don't mind the option there from either of them. Let's move on to our third game for the week. It is the Montreal Alouettes kicking off their 2021 season. Finally, after they had the bye in week 1, they're taking on the Edmonton Elks, looking to bounce back after a terrible performance. A terrible collapse, just not what we expected from the Elks against the Ottawa Red Blacks. Couldn't get in the end zone, ended up, 12 points on the board, only kicking 4 field goals, no touchdowns for what we expect to be this high-powered Edmonton offense against the Montreal team that is no longer, a bottom feeder when it comes to offensive talent in the CFL like they were as they cycled through quarterbacks and coaches for many years. There is a lot of offensive talent for the Alouettes. This should be an interesting matchup from a fantasy standpoint here. Let's take a look at, here are the best options for this matchup in week #2. Your quarterbacks, Vernon Adams Jr. for Montreal, Trevor Harris for Edmonton. I love Vernon Adams Jr. as an option if you want a guy with a high floor and a potential high ceiling. He averaged over 20 fantasy points a game in 2019. Only had a couple, 1 or 2 weeks, I believe, under 10 points. He even put up 40-something one week, a couple in the 30s. He's going to pick up a lot of points for you through both passing-wise and rushing-wise. 12 rushing touchdowns in 2019 to go along with a great quarterbacking performance, passing-wise there. So he's one of the higher-priced options at quarterback, but I always like a guy who's going to run the ball and is going to, as the quarterback, be the guy running the ball in for a touchdown. Because if they get the ball at the 1-yard line, some other teams, you might have a backup come in and dive it in. No, I think it's going to be Vernon Adams Jr. For this team doing those goal line stands and trying to punch the ball in. So that's 6 points right there off a 1-yard run to add to what he's going to do through the passing game. So I'm high on Adams Jr. I like him in this matchup against Edmonton. They did, to the Elks' credit, shut down Matt Nichols and the offense in Ottawa very soundly in week 1, but I'm expecting Montreal's offense. I think they have a little more firepower there, and I think I'm not staying away from Montreal from that standpoint of worrying about the Elks completely shutting them down here. Trevor Harris for Edmonton, I'm hesitant this week to go in his direction. I do think he's going to bounce back. I think he has to bounce back. He threw 3 interceptions. At least 2 of those were not typical throws we see from Harris in a typical week from him. I think it was he got off his game and they just couldn't produce. And so I think he's going to have a bounce back week. There's too much talent there for him not to. But I'm a bit hesitant because this is the same thing we've seen year after year from Edmonton, where they just don't get the ball into the end zone. They have great offensive numbers yardage-wise, but they can't punch it in. They end up settling for field goals. And if touchdowns are a big part of your week, which that's the recurring theme I'm telling you here, is touchdowns make a huge difference when it comes to CFL Fantasy. I'm maybe hesitant. I want to see that bounce back week from them before I go back in the Harris direction. Maybe it's just because I got burned slightly by him with a disappointing week 1 performance. The running backs, I like both of them. James Wilder Jr. was the top running back in week number 1. He got heavily used in the running game and the passing game, and I expect that to continue this week. So I'm high on Wilder at 6,559. And William Stanback is consistently one of my top running backs in the league. I find he's used heavily by Montreal. He is one of the top rushers in the game. He can put up, games of 200 yards. We've seen him do that before in his career. And he should be a good option there. The only thing is Vernon Adams might steal a couple, small, short rushing touchdowns from him because he does like to use his legs so much. So maybe there's a bit of concern there, but I am expecting a big week from Stanback here as well. The wide receivers for both of these teams are hard to project for me because I think it's the same thing I talked a little bit about with those Edmonton receivers last week, is there's just so much talent. How do you know where the ball's going? For Montreal, for that reason, just because we haven't seen them play a game this year, and I mean, look at this, Eugene Lewis, BJ Cunningham, Quan Bray, Jake Weineke. I like all 4 of these as wide receiver options, but that's the problem. I like all 4 of these as options. So, and I think the Alouettes do too. And I think we're going to see the ball spread pretty evenly between these guys. One might come out and have a huge week, and the next week it might be another one. So until we see some trends there, because we haven't seen this team play, I'm kind of staying away from Montreal receivers this week. I think a couple of them are going to have big days, and a couple of them we might think have a big day is going to disappoint just because the others got more targets. So I'm cautious on the receivers in Montreal for week 2. Again, I like Adams Jr. at quarterback, throwing the ball to all of these guys. I just don't know which one of them is going to get the heavy targets from a team we haven't seen yet. So my recommendation is maybe stay away from there, especially since they're not the cheapest options. It's not like you're getting a value pick guy that could for $2,500. And I like all of these receivers so evenly that it's hard to pick one over the other. Same thing for Edmonton. I thought maybe Greg Ellingson would be the big name guy last week, but he did put up 10 points, but only 5 catches there. Or Monty Edwards had himself a disappointing week. It was Darrell Walker, the big name target, the guy who put up the biggest week in that Elks receiving core. That's to be expected. I think he's going to be, honestly, their top target week in and week out as a go-to guy there. Besides, obviously, James Wilder Jr., who gets some solid passes as well. So I do like Walker. I find it kind of interesting that he was the best receiver in week 1, and now he comes in at the cheapest price for week number 2 out of those big 3. I'm a bit mystified by that. Not really sure how that happened. I noticed that as I was prepping here, and I thought that was a little bit interesting. So if you're going to take one of those guys and you're expecting a big bounce back week from Harris, I like Darrell Walker as the option there. Getting into the cheaper options, I think there's some interesting ones there too. Shai Ross came out and got himself a couple of targets, which I didn't necessarily expect him to be so heavily targeted by Edmonton. If that happens again this week, he put up 9.7 last time. If he gets some more targets this way, he's got great athletic ability. We've seen him go viral for dunking an Oreo mid-backflip. So he if a ball's thrown his way, he can make the plays, and that's not a bad sleeper option to take a chance on. But again, is he going to get the targets this week, or is Armani Edwards finally going to get the ball some more? Is Greg Ellenson going to get some more looks this way? It's so hard to tell when a team just has such a plethora of options available to them at wide receiver. Comparing the defenses here, the Elks defense, not a bad week against Ottawa. They did put up the, about 9 fantasy points in week 1, or 6 only. Just double checking my math here. And they shut them down yardage and touchdown-wise offensively, but they didn't put up a whole lot of turnovers. So they're not a big week there for Edmonton. Montreal's defense, 2019, was in the bottom half of the league statistically quite a bit. I don't think they've overhauled their defense a whole ton this year, so I'm skeptical to go with Montreal's defense in week number 1. Maybe that's a reason to look at Trevor Harris or James Wilder Jr. or one of those receivers more favorably this week for Edmonton. But I stay away from Montreal's defense this week, I think. And Edmonton as well, I think the maneuverability of Vernon Adams Jr. comboed with William Stanback and all those receivers, I think it's going to be a tough day maybe for the Elks defense. I'm expecting a high-scoring game between these two teams this week. And finally, let's move on to the final game of the week. The Hamilton Tiger Cats in Saskatchewan face the Riders. The Ticats coming off a game that was a very disappointing start to the season for them. Not the effort they were looking for against the Bombers there, where they were really missing some key pieces, which, whether or not they're back could make a difference in week number 2. The Riders, meanwhile, start strong against the BC Lions, 31-32-0 lead they jump out to in that game and only end up winning, 33-29, I believe the final score was. So a big collapse in the second half for the Riders. They're going to be looking for a better performance. They're going to be looking for a full 60-minute performance from the team this week. And this is another matchup where I have some intriguing options, I think, that I'm leaning towards in this particular game. So here are the best options available. Quarterbacks, 2 of your highest priced guys, Jeremiah Masoli, Cody Fajardo. I like Masoli for a bounce back week this week. That was not the Masoli we were used to seeing in that loss to the Bombers. He struggled. He completed less than 60% of his passes. He had a couple of dropped balls by his receivers, which contributed to that, which if they, catch those, that adds some more points to his total there. Look, Hamilton's offense struggled outside of that first drive against the Bombers. They put up only about 200 yards the rest of the way. They didn't put up any points on the board either after that first drive. I don't buy too much into 1 week of that. They were missing Chris Van Zyl, their best offensive lineman. They were missing Braylon Addison, DeVere Posey at wide receiver, which thinned things out there. They were facing the top run defense in the league in the Bombers. Masoli, I think, is going to have a bounce back week this week. And I like that option against the Riders defense that gave up 400 passing yards to a combined Nathan Rourke in his first career start, and Michael Riley, who was clearly injured and in the small amount he played, couldn't even throw the ball with proper zip on it. So if the Riders gave up 400 yards, to the Lions with those struggles they went through at quarterback, I don't see why Mazzoli can't put up at least 300 himself this week and get a couple more touchdowns on the board. So he is one of my top fantasy considerations at quarterback this week. Sean Thomas Erlington, 5,325. Don Jackson, is he going to be back this week? He was on the 1-game injured list last week. I think I'm staying away from either of these running backs right now this week. I'm expecting a bounce-back game from Erlington as well, but if Don Jackson does come back in, he might steal some touches away. So I do think there are other fantasy options available at running back, so I'm hesitant to go Thomas Erlington's way just for this reason until we see him given a heavy workload this week. I'm maybe staying away from either of these options for Hamilton. At wide receiver, a lot comes down to who's playing this week. Brandon Banks is always going to be a top target, but he's a guy that I say good luck if you want to try to fit him in your fantasy team. I did actually play around with a couple lineups last week where I tried to fit Banks in there because I thought he would have such a huge game against the Bombers. Only put up, in the 15-point range. Which is kind of low for Banks standards, and especially if you're paying $14,000 for him. So I doubt I'll get Banks in my lineup very many weeks personally, and I like some of the other options here. I like Braylon Addison if he's back from injury this week as a guy who's going to get heavily targeted, and I really like Jalen Acklin as a pick. I put him in my lineup last week. He produced for me. $5,005, he's becoming one of those top options for the Ticats, especially if Addison and Posey are not quite ready to go. So I like Acklin. He got heavily targeted by the Ticats in week 1. He picked up a touchdown. He picked up a solid amount of yardage. I expect another decent week from him in week 2, especially if that Ticats passing game is going to go off much better. Looking at the Riders, Cody Fajardo at quarterback. I don't love this option just based on the price. The Ticats defense, I think, is going to be better this week. I think a big issue for them in that loss to the Bombers was they just got tired because the offense got nothing going. They started the game decently well. But they just got tired as the game went along and struggled. And if the offense is better this week, the defense should be off the field a little more, get a little more rest. And I think with that, I still have concerns about that offensive line for Saskatchewan a little bit. I know they played decently well against BC, but I'm a little skeptical just based on price of Fajardo for this week. William Powell at running back's an interesting one. He got 1 carry in the second half against BC. 12 carries in the first half. Got a touchdown, which is something he does consistently, which will put you up some points there. But no usage in the second half in a game they were leading. I like him this week because I don't see Craig Dickinson. I don't see Jason Maas in that offense making the same mistake. I think there is some room to run the ball against the Ticats. The Bombers showed that last week. That's kind of been, one of the things you can do against their defense. They shut down the pass really well, but I think there's some room to run. And Powell being one of the best running backs in the league, if he gets the touches, big if on that, he can put up some big numbers against this Ticats defense. And I think he will get some more this week because the Riders can't be happy with how that went in week number 1, the way they handled the play calling in the second half there. And I think they will try to course correct for that a little bit. But this has been a problem all throughout the latter half of 2019 as well, where he just wasn't getting a ton of carries when he should have been. So there's some skepticism there, but I'm expecting a big week from William Powell. I'm thinking he'll hopefully get something in the 15 to 20 carries range. And again, pick up another touchdown like he did the week before. At wide receiver, your two biggest names, obviously, Kyron Moore, Shaq Evans. These are guys that if the passing game is going for Saskatchewan, pick one of them, either of them, maybe both of them. They're going to generally both have a pretty good day. Kyron Moore, I believe, picked up the touchdown last week. Evans had himself a decent 13-point-something points through the air. So I don't mind either of those options. Take your pick. I think in any given week, they're both going to have a decent week. Jordan Williams-Lambert did put up 10 points himself. Not a bad week for him. I'm still a little more hesitant on him in that middle price range. I'm just not seeing him as a consistently heavily targeted guy there, especially with the up-and-coming options, the value options here for the Riders. Braden Lenius and Mitchell Picton both had decent week number ones. Lenius did pick up the touchdown, as I mentioned previously, which was a nice grab for him. 11.1 points for him and 6.6 for Mitchell Picton. So a couple of options there at wide receiver, finally getting into the lineup for the Riders and starting to make some names for themselves. I believe both Canadian options there as well, so they should be mainstays if they're producing in that offense. And I like the value pick again, especially going back to what I said last week, that Braden Lenius was, Cody Fajardo said he was the MVP of training camp and could see him being a 1,000-yard receiver this year. So look for him to get more targets coming his way again this week. A very intriguing option there at a value price. Finally, the defenses for either of these teams. Saskatchewan's defense is high-priced. I think Hamilton's going to have a good bounce back. It looked like Chris Van Zyl was practicing from pictures I saw today. Again, check those depth charts. But if he's back, that's going to help the offensive line. That's going to give Mazzoli more time to make better decisions and produce more. So I'm not leaning towards the Riders' defense at that price there. And a bit of a down week for the Ticats defense. Didn't really put up any turnovers against the Bombers. I don't know what to make of them this week, to be honest, defensively. I think they'll have a better week if they're not on the field so often, but are they still going to put up the turnovers as often, especially against a premium quarterback like Cody Fajardo? So I don't love the option there, which seems to be the general theme that I have on defense this week. So those are the matchups for week number 2 in CFL. Some great fantasy options. I hope that was helpful for you, for me to go through the options I like from each team. I think there's a handful of guys at each position that I'm going to be toying with throughout the next couple of days, especially as the depth charts come out, the injury reports continue. And I think for me, honestly, it will come right down again until to lock in my lineup of deciding which way I want to go. There's 3 or 4 quarterbacks I've mentioned that I love this week. Some great value plays around the league, some great high-priced options, some potential, big point grabbers or disappointments. And that's really the case any single week when it comes to CFL Fantasy. So that is the CFL Fantasy Fix or the Canadian Football Fantasy Fix for week number 2. Check out the depth charts. Check out the injury reports. I can't stress this enough as they come out later in the week. As I mentioned, follow me on Twitter at CooperTrooper42. I'll be tweeting out anything notable from those there that will, impact your fantasy week at all. If you have any questions, lineups-wise, either throw them here in the YouTube comments, tweet them at me. I got a couple on Twitter this week, which was cool. That I'm always happy to answer them if I see them. I know I didn't see one in time because I was away all day, which was unfortunate, but I'm always happy to talk through fantasy options if you're stuck on some potentially. Do all of the YouTube things, like, comment, subscribe, share the link on social media, help get this out to more people. I greatly appreciate it if you do. I hope you enjoy this content. If you want to check out more CFL content, check out the Canadian Football Countdown on your favorite podcast platform. That is a podcast myself and my good friend Michael Garrell hosts each and every week, talking through the top storylines from around the CFL. So A little less of a fantasy focus there, more of a focus on the storylines. And then the fantasy focus is what I'm doing right here and what you're watching right now. So best of luck to you in week number 2 of CFL Fantasy, and I will be back again next week for your week 3 fantasy fix. Thank you. Take care. Have a good one. Bye.